Hello everyone, so this video is going to cover some topics which are going to probably get rather heavy. We are going to be talking about things like sexuality and trauma, so I just want to give everyone a heads up about that. We are going to be looking at these topics in terms of philosophy, psychology, and metaphysics, and so we aren't going to be looking at any of the uncomfortable details of any specific scenarios or events, which means that this video will remain PG-13 at worst. I'm really not trying to make this too weird or gross anyone out, but I know some people do show their kids my stuff sometimes, so you probably want to watch this first and then decide whether this is appropriate or not, depending upon their age or whatever other considerations might be relevant. Again, there's not going to be any blood or guts or anything lewd in this video, but this is definitely the kind of video that could result in some really awkward conversations from your kids, so just be aware of that. The myths of ancient Mesopotamia provide us with some of the earliest written accounts of mythical narratives. Through the birth of writing, these myths have come to serve as a window into a world in which civilization as we know it had only developed very recently. Through these myths, we see a people whose spirits in many ways remained intimately connected to a world which preceded the existence of cities and farmland. These myths are therefore expressions of a world which was in the process of undergoing a profound metamorphosis as the human psyche and human life world came to transfigure themselves in accordance with modes of socialization and modes of relating to the natural environment, which were radically distinct from those of their Neolithic and Paleolithic forebears. Prior to the development of permanent sedentary settlements, houses, and city walls, human awareness experienced itself as being continuous with nature. Within Neolithic burial sites, we see the practice of covering the bodies of the dead in red ochre, a substance which we can understand as representative of the blood of the earth itself. Human beings felt themselves to have been born out of the earth, and in death we return to this primordial womb. The red ochre was thus intended to be a magical invocation of the life-creating power of menstrual blood, which would thereby ensure the eventual re-embodiment of the dead through rebirth. Contrary to their representations in popular culture, our Paleolithic and Neolithic ancestors did not actually live within caves, but rather caves seem to have served a purpose much akin to that of temples in later time periods. Descending into the cave was a descent into the life-creating womb of the earth itself, which was understood to possess the magical powers of vitality and fecundity which animated the world. Within the darkness of these earthen wombs, paintings were created so as to invoke, through formal similarity, the powers of nature which human beings were required to navigate in order to survive. Yet as human beings came to develop sedentary settlements, this relationship with nature came to change. Cell membrane-like walls came to separate us from the Great Mother, and agricultural practices came to create a division between the life world, which was now shaped by human labor, and an external environment which was shaped by the dark, primal, and unconscious powers of nature herself. Human consciousness had increasingly begun to turn its attention away from the primal, chthonic darkness of its origin and towards the celestial realm, the heavens which were representative of the Great Father rather than the Great Mother. Unlike the vitalizing and reproductive powers of terrestrial mana, characterized as chaotic and formless darkness, The sky was seen as the realm of air, breath, fire, light, and form. It came to be understood that the life world which man had created, the world of houses, city walls, and tilled fields, had been created through the powers which had been bestowed from above, rather than from below. The nets used by fishermen reflected the web-like lattices of the stars. The homes which humanity constructed increasingly came to express rectilinear architectural motifs, which reflected the geometry of straight lines which we saw within the zodiacal constellations. This was in contrast to the predominantly curvilinear architectural forms which we see in earlier sites, which continue to mirror the organic morphologies of the natural environment rather than the stars above. Overall, humanity came to feel that its survival and flourishing were now facilitated primarily through the powers of order and hierarchical structure, which it drew from the transcendental realm of the Great Skyfather, rather than from the vital, abyssal powers of formlessness and primality, which arose from the writhing depths of darkness beneath our feet. What we see in these transformations is a narrative of spiritual re-territorialization, in which the human sense of self and the human sense of self-world relationality came to undergo a titanic renegotiation of boundaries. Perhaps the most poignant and concise expression of this renegotiation is to be found within the Sumerian cosmogonic myth of the birth of the world and humanity through the actions of the Sky Father Abzû, the hero king Marduk, and the oceanic leviathan Tiamat. The Sumerians saw the earth as residing within a kind of overlap between two great oceans of spiritual power. There was, of course, the actual ocean itself, which consisted of salt water. Salt water is, of course, salty and therefore akin to blood. Blood is associated with the archetypal powers of femininity, and specifically with the life-bestowing powers of the womb. The chthonic ocean below was thus seen as the domain of primordial yin, feminine, chaotic, dark, and unpredictable, much like the sea itself. Yet above them, the Sumerians saw a celestial ocean, one characterized by fresh water, which the Sumerians associated with semen. Fresh water falls from above, and in a sense it is that which impregnates the land so as to allow for the birth of natural flora. One can also create fresh water by boiling it using fire, and fire is likewise associated with the celestial realm. The sky was seen as a great veil, and the stars were seen as being akin to tiny pinpricks or projectors, through which the light produced by the celestial fires of the beyond could shine through and thereby spiritually mold the world below. The celestial realm can thus be understood as the domain of a primordial yang energy. Within this creation myth, it is said that before the birth of the world, the celestial fresh waters and abyssal salt waters were undivided. They were unified within a primeval state of undifferentiated archaic oneness. The Sumerians even spoke of underground reservoirs of water as being vestiges of the time before the two great oceans came to be divided. Yet the waters did come to divide, and thereby two primordial deities came to represent them and rule over their respective domains. Abzû, the god of the celestial fresh waters, and Tiamat, the draconic leviathan goddess of the chthonic salt waters. These two primordial deities then mated with one another, thereby becoming the progenitors of several generations of deities. As these new generations of deities set about, they evidently created too much noise for Abzû's liking. Abzû was of course the god of celestial order, and therefore it is no surprise that he would be upset by the more chaotic nature of his grandchildren who bore within themselves the chaotic primal blood of his consort Tiamat. Increasingly enraged by this noise, Abzû devised a plan to murder all of the younger deities, but the other gods came to learn of this plan before Abzû could set it in motion. The younger deities then rebelled against Abzû and murdered him so as to usurp his rulership of the cosmos. As Tiamat learned of Abzû's death, she birthed into being an ensemble of 11 dragon-like monsters and commanded them to devour her rebellious children. Yet the god Marduk, a god of kingship identified with the planet Jupiter, resolved to defeat Tiamat and her monstrous offspring and ultimately comes to slay her by capturing her in a net and then impaling her with a spear. Marduk, being associated with the sky, is clearly a representative of a form of masculine order, and within the net he uses to capture her, we see again a symbolic representation of the celestial lattice. The spear, then, can be understood as an object of phallic signification. It is clear that what we find to be represented within this narrative is a primordial conflict between masculine and feminine forces. But to understand the deeper implications of this narrative, we must now go deeper into the nature of the human psyche and how the human psyche develops in relation to the dynamics of birth, death, sensuality, and subjectivity. In previous videos, we've examined what the psychologist Carl Jung referred to as the individuation process, by which human beings come to develop a sense of self-agency and self-identity. Influenced by Carl Jung's work, the comparative mythologist Joseph Campbell developed a model which he called the myth cycle, or the hero's journey, an archetypal narrative structure which Campbell believed to be at work within all of humanity's mythical narratives, including historical narratives, novels, films, religious narratives, and even the stories that we develop so as to make sense of our own lives. What Campbell's work shows us is that the individuation process is always a process of separation, transfiguration, and reintegration. The hero separates from the home or the family. He is forced out of the comfortable world of safety and familiarity by what Campbell refers to as the call to adventure. From the world of normalcy, the hero then comes to cross the first threshold into the world of the supraordinary, the supernatural, the liminal, dangerous, and uncanny. The hero passes from the Neptunian world of idyllic oneness through the lunar threshold, which divides the familiar from the alien. The hero must then learn to survive within the alien world. He must develop new skills, acquire new knowledge, abandon whatever comforts or expectations he might be carrying with him as vestiges of the world of normalcy, which can no longer serve him within the external world, which he must now come to navigate. It is usually at this point in the story that the hero comes under the tutelage of what Jung called the senex, the wise old man who serves as a kind of psychopomp or guide, who can serve to assist the hero in acquiring or abandoning whatever might be needed in his process of maturation and self-realization. This senex is a very paternalistic archetype, and thus we can understand this archetypal personality as being Jovian in nature, a representative of the primordial Sky Father, who bestows the powers of self-discipline, order, frugality, patience, and wisdom. So now let us pause to take account of this in terms of the development of human subjectivity in a more general sense. The Neptunian realm of idyllic oneness and secure familiarity can be understood as being a kind of archetypal womb. Within the womb, the infant's needs are, under normal circumstances, attended to directly by the mother's body. Within this state of oceanic, dreamlike awareness, there is not yet any sense of separation between the consciousness of the child and the body of the mother. For the infant, there is little indication or concern for where the self ends and the other begins. In a sense, we can see that within this phase, there is no sense of selfhood as we commonly understand it, no sense of subject-object division or boundary between self and world. Yet, following the actual process of birth itself, the child is thrust into a world which is distinctly separate from itself, and thus the sense of distinct selfhood comes to develop in its most basic form. The child feels itself to be identical with its bodily needs, and the child's primary concern is with whether those bodily needs are being met or not. The child's selfhood is therefore localized within what we could call the life body, etheric body, or the physiological layer of the morphogenetic field. At this stage, the child remains almost entirely dependent upon the mother, and thus the sense of selfhood remains in many ways nascent. The child's consciousness remains in many ways an extension of the mother's consciousness. Yet, as the child grows older, the child comes to be more independent. It learns to develop control over its own body, and as this occurs, the felt sense of internal subjectivity ascends into the realm of behavior. The sense of internality becomes localized within what we could call the astral body, or the ethological layer of the morphogenetic field. As this process continues, this ascension brings the child's subjectivity into the realm of the psyche, and the adolescent consciousness comes to feel itself to be identical with the thought forms that comprise the individual's psychical realm. All the while, the child continues to become ever more independent as the child faces challenges which it must overcome through the development of skills and knowledge, and the reshaping of beliefs, expectations, values, and patterns of behavior. Now looking back to the emergence of human civilization, we can see a very similar pattern unfolding. Prior to the development of sedentary settlements and agricultural practices, human beings remained, in a sense, within the womb of nature, as there was not yet any division between the realm of the human life world and the realm of the natural environment. The sense of separation between human awareness and the world around us remained very much permeable and nebulous. Our sense of subjectivity remained localized within the life body, within the flow of blood within our veins, which connected us to our tribes through ties of kinship. There was not yet any sense of selfhood, which could be understood separately from such relations of blood, birth, death, and sexuality. Our consciousness was of a necessarily tribal rather than individualistic nature. Yet nature is just as much savage, violent, and unpredictable as it is nurturing, and ultimately human beings would look to the sky, to the celestial Father, so as to develop technologies such as fire, agriculture, and architecture, with which we could then come to master nature, and thereby protect ourselves from its destructive tendencies. Fire is seen in the sun and stars, which are, of course, within the celestial realm, and when fire does occur naturally within the terrestrial realm, it is most often sparked by lightning, which likewise descends to Earth from the heavens. Agricultural practices depend upon astronomy. Our ancestors needed to carefully observe the ordered clockwork processions of the celestial realm in order to effectively cultivate crops. We came to develop an immensely ambivalent relationship to the Great Mother, as there was a constant danger that the boundaries between the human and the natural might be disintegrated by the chaotic violence of the natural world. As we became ever more acclimated to our thoroughly humanized life world, the world of villages, tilled fields, and city walls, the Great Mother was felt ever more to be a dangerous and unpredictable other, which we needed to protect ourselves against in order to survive. Within the grips of this perennial struggle of life and death, the powers of the sky, the powers of the Great Father, were the powers that we came to depend upon. Within the development of the individual human psyche, we once again see these archetypal dynamics mirrored within a much smaller time frame, as though zooming in upon an immense, self-similar fractal. As a child's consciousness comes to separate from that of the mother, the child searches for a father figure, which can serve the role of the senex. The child is gradually striving towards the goal of independence and autonomy, and in doing so, the child looks to the father figure in order to mirror what are perceived to be significations of competence. Within this primordial triad of mother, father, and child, we begin to see the development of nascent psychosexual dynamics, as the child's unconscious mind begins to develop its internal representations of masculinity and femininity. But before we can begin to look at the sexual aspects of this process of development, we need to first bring our attention to the nature of trauma, and how trauma relates to the territorialization of the self-world boundaries, which give shape to human subjectivity. Trauma is typically understood as an event which results in extreme distress for an individual, oftentimes in such a way that the event comes to result in lingering psychological problems, such as anxiety and paranoia, which persist long after the event has occurred. If we look at the characteristics of trauma and the theoretical work within psychodynamics and depth psychology which have attempted to understand trauma, we find a number of common themes. Not all intense, painful, or frightening experiences are necessarily traumatic, as such experiences do not always result in the lingering repercussions which are characteristic of trauma. Oftentimes, intense and painful experiences are truly no more than intense and painful, but with traumatic experiences, the subject's psyche comes to undergo pronounced and sometimes even debilitating transmutations. Oftentimes, traumatic experiences result in a dramatic loss of social trust and the sense of emotional safety, as individuals come to be afflicted by intense feelings of paranoia following such experiences. Traumatic experiences can also often have an immense effect upon one's sense of self-efficacy and self-security. Some psychologists have therefore observed that traumatic experiences are specifically those experiences in which a sense of trust, either in others or in one's own capabilities, comes to be shattered. A traumatic experience is not simply uncomfortable, terrifying, or painful, but moreover, a traumatic experience is one in which the basic expectations which ground the individual's sense of internal self-security prove to be unable to contend with the traumatic event. Trauma is therefore a kind of breakdown. Specifically, it is a breakdown of the boundaries which define the sense of selfhood, and a breakdown which therefore demands that those boundaries between self and world come to be reconfigured so as to protect the person from the possibility of such events occurring in the future. A traumatic experience is, in a sense, a breakdown of meaning, as it is something which the psyche simply cannot make sense of within the framework of expectations which ground the sense of individual selfhood. The sense of trust in others or even in one's own body or mind come to contract inward in such a manner that the person comes to feel much, much smaller. In metaphysical terms, that is exactly what has occurred. What is significant here for our current purposes is the manner by which trauma comes to give shape to the human sense of individual selfhood through the renegotiation of boundaries. It is often specifically through encountering events that we simply cannot contend with that the basic shape of our sense of self-world delineation comes to be shaped. Not all trauma necessarily results in that sense of selfhood coming to be reshaped in a way that is maladaptive, though those cases are the ones that we most often associate with the term. Yet if we properly understand the nature of trauma, we can see that in fact trauma is a necessary and omnipresent feature of human development, and one which, in most cases, we do manage to contend with in an effective and healthy manner. But if we are to conclude that traumatic events are those which contribute to the shaping and reshaping of the human self, then there is one such trauma that all human beings carry with them: the trauma of one's physiological birth. The concept of birth trauma is most associated with the psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, who pioneered research pertaining to altered states of consciousness and the field of transpersonal psychology. Through his research, outlined within his work The Cosmic Game, Grof came to see that within the core of the human psyche, there resides a lingering trauma complex related to the actual occurrence of one's own birth. Through exploration of altered states, Grof saw that his patients often came to relive specific phases of the birthing process, with such experiences often being accompanied by dreamlike imagery, which symbolically represented the emotional nature of these four distinct phases. Each of these phases, which Grof came to refer to as the perinatal matrices, were seen to be characterized by a distinct archetypal significance. The first perinatal matrix relates to the state of uterine existence, which precedes the birth process. It is characterized by a sense of idyllic oneness, and often accompanied by imagery pertaining to nature or the ocean. The second perinatal matrix is characterized by contraction and a sense of alienation and claustrophobia as the infant comes for the first time to experience its embryonic environment as an external other, and the struggle of life and death begins to ensue. The third perinatal matrix is the struggle to emerge from the birth canal, a phase which is often accompanied by imagery of morbid violence and often disturbing sexual motifs. It is in this phase that the Freudian id, or will to life, of the infant comes to awaken for the first time. The animalistic impulses which normally operate within the unconscious depths of the psyche and which concern the basic conditions of survival. Within the fourth perinatal matrix, we have the emergence of the infant into the outside world, often accompanied by imagery of combustion and release, electrical discharge, or the first gasping breaths after surfacing from underwater. Stanislav Grof's perinatal matrices are a topic I've covered at greater length in previous videos. Check the link above. But for now, what is significant here is that we can see in Grof's research that the basic structures of the individual birth trauma share an archetypal self-similarity with the individuation process as a whole. The process of separation from idyllic oneness, followed by a descent into the dark and dangerous unknown, ultimately concluded by a kind of spiritual releasement, which resolves the dialectical frictions between self and other. The oneness of embryonic existence becomes the two of mother and child, and within the mother's arms, the two become one yet again, but in a new way. Undifferentiated oneness becomes a unity of difference. And yet, if such reunification does not occur, then the possibility of integrating the child's selfhood with the otherness of the world in general may become compromised. The child's mind may then come to perceive all things other, and in particular those that seem to signify the internal mother image, as external threats to be avoided, subdued, or annihilated. It is this complex of self-other alienation which seems to lie within the psychosexual core of serial criminals, and it seems to likewise be the psychosexual core of the slaying of Tiamat by Marduk within the Sumerian creation narrative. Moreover, we can now see that this exact same pattern of archetypal self-similarity is also reflected within the historical development of human consciousness. As we saw previously, the emergence of a sense of separate human identity within the birth of civilization was a process by which the state of undifferentiated unity with nature, that is, with the archetypal mother, came to rupture apart as boundaries came to form between nature and a distinctly human life world. Within the process of physiological birth, within the process of psychological individuation, and within the evolution of human consciousness as a whole, we see a process by which a state of idyllic unity with the mother gives rise to defined boundaries with the archetypal other. An external world which is now seen to be potentially hostile, and which the individuated identity must protect itself against in order to maintain its sense of self-identity. What this all might seem to suggest, then, is that immediately prior to the period which we understand as the birth of civilization, a period of immense trauma must have occurred, such that humanity's sense of oneness with nature came to be ruptured. It is perhaps the lingering trauma of that rupture, which we see reflected in the Sumerian creation myth with the slaying of the chthonic Tiamat by the celestial Marduk. We can now begin to see how the unfolding of this dynamic comes to result in the basic symbolic motifs of both sexuality and violence, which characterize our worlds of unconscious fantasy at both individual and collective scales. Marduk subdues the Great Mother Tiamat, who is seen as the ultimate representative of the chaotic, primal, and unpredictable forces of nature which threaten the order of creation. In this confrontation, Marduk uses first the net, which we can see as representing the archetypal powers of order and stability which restrain the forces of chaotic darkness. The power of such order is derived from the sky, from the archetypal Senex or Skyfather. Marduk then slays Tiamat with a spear, a weapon which is quite obviously phallic and therefore masculine in nature. So now let us consider in detail how this can be understood in terms of trauma, and specifically how it relates to the nature of birth trauma specifically. As we have seen, trauma is the process by which the structures of trust and security come to be broken down and then re-territorialized so as to give shape to a sense of distinct selfhood. The birth trauma, therefore, is the first such re-territorialization, in which the initial boundaries between self and world come to be developed. But with the development of such boundaries, we then also have the development of the most basic anxieties, which characterize the sense of subjectivity. At the most basic level, anxiety emerges from the sense that the boundaries of stability, trust, and certainty, whether in regards to the world, other human beings, or even one's own body, might come to break down. This is the primal fear of death, that the boundaries between self and world might come to break down such that the world comes to re-subsume us once more. It is the fear that our sense of selfhood, or the stability within our own lives and sense of meaning, might come to be drastically reconfigured by the chaotic tumultuousness of a world which is separate from us and which we have little or no control over. The basic structure of this primal anxiety is shaped by the unconscious imagery of the birth trauma itself, and this anxiety then serves as the engine for the most basic drives of libidinality, which drive the human psyche, and which in fact drive life in general. On the one hand, this birth trauma anxiety can manifest as a will to return to the state of idyllic oneness which preceded one's sense of self-separation. There is a will to dissolve the boundaries between self and other, which are the root of our subjective anxiety. One of the most basic ways that this will to return can then manifest is through sexuality. Within the French language, the phrase la petite mort literally means the little death and is a euphemism for sexual climax. Within this quirk of language, we can see an expression of the fact that there is an archetypal parallel between the breakdown of boundaries which characterizes sexual releasement and the breakdown of boundaries which characterizes death itself. In a very real sense, the sexual drive and the death drive, Eros and Thanatos, are two sides of the same coin. Within sexuality, the boundaries between self and other come to dissolve, and within this dissolution, there is an immense release of the tensions which arise from the sense of those boundaries. Due to the manner by which the birth trauma complex comes to determine the shape of the gap or division between self and other, we see within human sexuality a tendency towards a reenactment of one's birth trauma. I'm not going to go into too much detail with examples of what I mean by that because this is YouTube and I am trying to keep this PG-13, but one way that we can see this is in how something like the act of choking can be seen as correlated with perinatal matrix 2 and the constrictive nature of that phase of the birth trauma complex. More generally, we can see within human sexuality the tendency towards a kind of symbolic, theatrical reenactment of rather violent archetypal imagery. There is a kind of play or mock struggle of violent conquest and submission which is acted out as a kind of reenactment of the birth trauma. In fact, we can see that in many ways sexual acts often play out as a kind of reverse replay of the basic motifs of the perinatal matrices which Groff observed in his clinical studies. The structure of the birth trauma, along with the various traumatic experiences which we undergo throughout the individuation process more generally, come to give shape to the basic structure of one's sense of selfhood, and the shape of that sense of selfhood is then mirrored within the shape of sexual libidinality. Our sense of subjectivity is thus, in a sense, a desire-shaped wound. Yet the particular manner in which this dynamic can come to manifest can be highly variable. This lure of idyllic oneness and boundary dissolution can also be seen in many religious and spiritual motifs, and in fact we can see the religious impulse towards a sense of ultimate belonging and oneness with the universe as being self-similar to the structures of human sexuality, but mirrored at a more cosmic scale. We wish to resolve the sense of self-world delineation. Within sexuality, this dissolution of boundaries is mediated by the body of another human being, while within spiritual ecstasy there is no such mediation. Generally speaking, we see these forms of spiritual or sexual ecstasy as being a good thing, yet of course it is well known that these dynamics can also come to unfold in ways that are immensely pathological and even deadly as well. And it is the danger of such pathological manifestation that we see in the slaying of the Great Mother by the heroic Marduk within the Sumerian creation myth. The sense of self-world delineation can come to form in a way that is immensely hostile and antagonistic, and this can come to manifest as a sense of intense paranoia, as well as in extremely dangerous forms of psychosexual pathology, such as that which we see exemplified in figures such as Jack the Ripper, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and many others. There are a great many ways in which this process of psychosexual development can come to unfold, and therefore, there are a great many ways in which this development can come to take on deeply unsettling or even horrific forms, as the reenactment of the violent nature of the birth process comes to manifest in a way that is not simply play or theatrics. Within the myth of Marduk and Tiamat, this is precisely what we see. Nature itself is seen as a violent, monstrous, and inhuman threat which must be subdued and destroyed. The Great Mother has become the Great Other, and only through the powers of coercion and domination can order survive against the onslaught of abyssal chthonic chaos. What we see encapsulated and exemplified within this myth is the basic shape of a developing sense of antagonism and hostility between the sense of human identity and the natural world itself. There is therefore a sense of hostility between the masculine or solar sense of human existence on the one hand and the feminine or lunar sense of human existence on the other. Now, I want to be very clear here that this is not necessarily the same as a hostility between actual men and women within human societies. This video isn't really about the history or sociology of gender relations, and so that will have to be a topic for another day. Here I am primarily referring to the different aspects of the human sense of selfhood. There is a masculine sense of self-identity, which we see expressed within both men and women, and then there is also a feminine sense of self-identity, which we see expressed within both men and women. The solar aspect of self-identity regards the way in which the self experiences itself as an individual which is separate from others and separate from the world. This sense of identity is masculine in the sense that it is the aspect of the human being which comes to differentiate itself from the archetypal mother through developing a sense of independent selfhood. In contrast to this, we have the lunar sense of selfhood, which is fundamentally interrelational in character. It is the sense of self which is understood in terms of blood and kinship, as we see exemplified in the relationship between parent and child. If you are a mother, for example, and your motherhood is central to your sense of self-identity, then that means your sense of self-identity is defined in terms of a connection rather than merely a distinction between yourself and your child. We think of this archetype as fundamentally feminine, but of course we can also see this exact same formation within men. When the fatherhood of a father is central to his sense of who he is, then we can understand this as a lunar and thus archetypally feminine sense of subjectivity. It is the solar, masculine aspect of one's subjectivity which comes to individuate within the process of the hero's journey or myth cycle. Now, some literary critics have argued that the masculine nature of the hero's journey might have something to do with a patriarchal bias within human cultures, but I think that those arguments tend to deeply misunderstand the nature of how sexual differences actually operate within the human psyche. Hollywood has developed a recent habit of gender-swapping hero characters in films. Now, whether you like any of those films or not, the important point to observe here is that as these female characters go through the hero's journey, it is specifically the masculine, solar aspect of the woman's psyche, her sense of self-competence and individual self-identity, which comes to develop when she goes through that hero's journey. A very well-executed example of this can be seen in the 1979 sci-fi horror film Alien, in which the film's protagonist, Ripley, struggles against alien monstrosities which in various ways signify the dark, morbid, and chaotic aspects of the devouring mother archetype. Within the film, we see numerous instances of symbolism which point towards motifs of motherhood, embryonic gestation, childbirth, and sexual paranoia. The aspect of Ripley's psyche which differentiates itself and survives against the devouring mother archetype is that solar, masculine aspect of her being. Her competence, courage, independence, and will to survive are the aspects which we see developed and brought to bear throughout the course of the film. As such, I don't think that there is exactly a heroine's journey per se, which mirrors the masculine nature of the hero's journey in a process of separation, transformation, individuation, and reintegration. Rather, the feminine mirror image of the solar hero's journey is actually the very lunar process of pregnancy and childbirth, by which the human sense of self-identity comes to be reconfigured in a fundamentally interrelational way through the achievement of parenthood. The character Ripley is still who she is, even after all the monstrous aliens and most of her fellow crew members have been slain, because her sense of self-identity as a character is defined primarily in a solar, masculine manner. Marduk does not cease to be who he is after Tiamat has been slain, as his sense of individual being is derived from the powers which he draws from the transcendental realm of the celestial sky, even if the animating blood within his veins is continuous with Tiamat. In contrast, a figure like the Mother Mary is only the Mother Mary in relation to her child. The lunar sense of self-identity is defined in terms of continuity, rather than simply in terms of distinction. When we look to the realm of mythology and fiction, we don't see very many examples in which this process of achieving parenthood is romanticized in the same manner as the hero's journey. We don't really see the process of self-becoming, which was underwent by characters like the Mother Mary in her pregnancy and childbirth. Again, we could interpret this as a kind of patriarchal bias which causes us to favor the solar masculine process of becoming over and above the lunar feminine process of self-development through life continuity. However, I think that the reason for this asymmetry may be much more archetypal in nature. There is something very universal and transcendental about the nature of the hero's journey. Heroes and heroines come to derive the powers which they need from the Senex, the archetypal father, and from the sky, the realm of transcendental forms. Through becoming the hero or heroine, the character comes to participate in a form which transcends and subsumes the particular and immanent. The character comes to connect with something which, in a sense, transcends space and time. As such, the hero's journey lends itself perfectly to being mythologized, being universalized into a story which is eternal and general in nature. Yet with parenthood, I think we see almost the exact opposite dynamic at play. Your parenthood is defined specifically in terms of your relation to your actual child, first and foremost. The particularity and specificity of that relationship and the embodied nature of that immanence is itself fundamental to that process. If you become a hero, then there's a sense in which you can pack up and go be a hero in a completely different world with completely different people in a different time and place. But with parenthood, you are not a parent to children in general. You are a parent to your own child, and the particularity of that relationship is paramount. The process of procreation, pregnancy, and gestation are, of course, immensely personal in nature. Gestation itself is not a public affair. It occurs within the inner darkness of the body itself, rather than within the public spotlight. It is a journey of deeply intimate feeling, much more so than it is a journey of generalizable actions and ideas, and as such, the parenthood journey simply does not lend itself very well to becoming mythologized in the same manner as the hero's journey. Now, if we broaden our scope once more and look to the full scope of human history since the birth of civilization during the late Neolithic period, what we see, especially in the westernmost forms of civilization, is an imperative drive towards the realization of the sense of solar, separate individuality which distinguishes its identity from that of nature. Through this process, we see furthermore the drive towards the realization of the sense of individual human self-identity in contrast to the collective tribe or nation. One of our earliest myths is the Epic of Gilgamesh, in which a singular, heroic individual undergoes a kind of heroic journey, in which he takes an ambivalent or even defiant stance against his own people and his gods. Later, we see heroes such as Odysseus and Achilles, and historical figures such as Alexander of Macedon and Julius Caesar, and in these stories we see that the sense of individual uniqueness and individual greatness are valorized in a way that we see expressed much more rarely in more Eastern cultures. We can see that the West is animated fundamentally by a kind of solar spirit, whereas what we see in the East is a much more lunar spirit, one which attempts to cultivate and maintain the relations of collective responsibility, honor, and kinship which weave such societies together. In the West, gold, associated with the sun, was considered to be a substance of the highest symbolic value. When the Spanish conquistadors conquered the Americas in the 16th century, gold was taken back to Spain to enlarge the wealth of the conquerors or the Spanish crown, but the silver, associated archetypally with the moon, was used to trade with China, as silver was the only form of payment the Chinese Empire would accept. This difference of symbolic value attributed to gold and silver is significant in that it mirrors the more fundamental difference of primary values between the East and West. In the West, we see much greater emphasis on individual uniqueness, greatness, ingenuity, and novelty. In the East, we see much greater emphasis upon duty, collective responsibility, and conscientious adherence to social and familial obligations. The West has oriented itself towards the separation and individuation of individual human beings, as well as the separation and individuation of humanity as a whole in contrast to the natural world. Within most Eastern traditions, morality itself is often understood to be defined in terms of collective norms and obligations. Being good is understood as being good in relation to what the collective expects of you, and there is very little indication of a transcendental morality, which the individual person can come into accordance with independently of such social relations. In the West, however, it is implied within our myths, religious traditions, and popular culture that the collective can oftentimes simply be wrong, and that an individual has more obligation to his own personal moral conscience than he does to collective expectations. Within the Christian Gospels, for example, Jesus tells his followers that in order to truly follow his path, his followers will be required to subordinate their familial obligations to the higher purpose of God's will. It is specifically this emphasis upon individual selfhood which has created the conditions necessary for the emphasis on personal interiority which we see in modern consciousness. Prior to the birth of Christianity, we see very little attention to the internal, subjective states of individual human beings. The idea that literature or poetry could be used to examine the private interiority of emotional experience was essentially unheard of prior to the instances of this which we find in the Christian Gospels. Thus, rather ironically, it has been precisely the solar orientation of Western civilization which has created the conditions necessary for the mythical expression of the feminine parenthood journey and other such mythologized expressions which we see in popular culture, in which the interior relationality of characters comes to play a central role. As this process has continued to develop, the West has come to develop ever further the sense of individual identity and individual freedom in a manner that has been utterly unprecedented throughout all of human history. Likewise, our sense of distinct identity and separation from nature has become vastly more acute than has been the case at any other phase of history. Our sense of solar selfhood has come to be highly developed over the course of the past several thousand years, and yet this process of individuation must be accompanied by a parallel process of reintegration in order to avoid coming to manifest pathologically. As we have already seen, the sense of separate solar selfhood creates immense anxiety as the sense of boundary between self and world becomes more acute. This anxiety must then be resolved through relations of trust, sensuality, or spiritual oneness, and if this reintegration does not occur, then such anxieties can manifest as an intense and crippling sense of paranoia, or even as a sense of hostility, which orients itself towards the conquest, domination, or even annihilation of that which is felt to be other, whether that be nature, one's own family or social community, or objects of sexual desire. Over the course of the modern period, we have seen this process of individuation mutate into increasingly extreme forms of alienation. The capitalistic conquest of nature and commodification of the human mind and body have ultimately given rise to the complete breakdown of communal and familial relationships between human beings. Healthy individual human psyches can only be consistently cultivated by cohesive family structures, and cohesive family structures can only come to be consistently produced within cohesive communities, which are woven together by trust, interdependence, and a shared language of practices and relations of meaning. The lunar, interpersonal spirit within modern civilization has come to atrophy in a manner which can only be described as utterly catastrophic. And I don't think it is even remotely hyperbolic to say that we are currently undergoing a complete breakdown of the capacities by which human life worlds are able to sustain and perpetuate themselves. This alienation is extremely dangerous in that it creates the conditions for widespread psychopathology, violence, and a veritable plague of despair. In a sense, we have simply erased the feminine, lunar aspects of our cultures, and yet, in another sense, this archetypal feminine spirit has come to manifest in a morbid and pathological manner. Our society has become the devouring mother, which we saw expressed in the 1979 Alien film. Our society is infantilizing its children such that they are no longer able to individuate properly into physically or psychologically healthy adults. As I've stated previously, when socio-spiritual forces become malignant, we see them transfigure into inverted, monstrous parodies of themselves, and we can see this process of inversion within both the masculine and feminine dimensions of the modern life world. The hyper-narcissism of modernity ultimately comes to manifest as the systemic disintegration of the human ego in general, and human beings come into adulthood without any sense of competence or individual selfhood. And of course, there is the breakdown of human sexuality, which we can see as a microcosm of this entire pathological dynamic which has come to unfold. People are no longer engaging in sexual activity because people simply don't know each other anymore, and that means that the conditions of trust which are needed for the facilitation of sexuality are simply absent. When sexuality and reproduction do happen in the absence of such foundational trust, relationships come to be built upon quicksand. If those relations come to produce children, then it is very likely that the stress produced by those children will come to annihilate the very relationships which produce them, as those relationships are very rarely held together by a sense of mutual obligation, which is able to actually survive the periods of mutual dissatisfaction which invariably arise within long-term relationships. Obviously, I could continue to talk about the malignancies of modern culture ad nauseum. It should not be news to anyone watching this video that we are watching our civilization cannibalize itself, but in order to orient ourselves here, we must be able to understand why this process is happening, and thus what the ultimate endpoint of this process must look like. Throughout human history, human life worlds have generally been held together by different combinations of two primary factors. On the one hand, we have the sense of obligation to cultural norms themselves, which we see exemplified most intensely within Eastern cultures. There is a social imperative towards being good, and being good means living up to the expectations placed upon you by your family and community. What is good simply is what the social norms decree. Such societies tend to be very cohesive, but they also tend to be highly resistant to change and innovation, and it is therefore also extremely difficult to alter social norms that might themselves be destructive once they come to concretize. If you are a special snowflake like myself with a fire of rebelliousness burning in your chest, you absolutely do not want to live in a social obligation-centered society. You will not have a fun time. Being ostracized by one society due to perceived transgressions can be quite literally a matter of life and death, not only for you, but also for your relatives and children, as it is very often the case that dishonor is seen to spread through blood relations in such societies. Within Western cultures, in which individuality has been far more heavily developed and emphasized, we see a more pronounced tendency towards the second form of social cohesion, that of violence power. If we look at the Roman Empire, for example, we see a society which actually had a rather laissez-faire attitude towards social norms. The Romans didn't really care that much about whether or not everyone was participating in the same rituals or whether the same codes of honor and conduct were being adhered to throughout the empire. As long as Rome received its taxes, that's all that really mattered, and Rome ensured this, not by drastically transforming the cultures of the vanquished, but simply by using the omnipresent threat of annihilation to ensure that the slaves and conquered peoples stayed in line. As the empire came to develop, the threat of violence became less necessary, as it was in many ways supplanted by the coercive power of money itself. Financial power came to serve as a cleaner, more efficient substitute for violence power, but ultimately the underlying dynamic was the same. If one failed to accord with the demands of the empire, then one would either bleed to death or one would starve to death, and the Romans could care less which gods you prayed to beforehand. In contrast, the Chinese Empire was always very concerned with ensuring the spread and conformity of Han Chinese cultural practices. The goal of imperial policies was often oriented towards ensuring that everyone in the empire felt themselves to be a part of a unified Han Chinese identity. The Western world, in contrast, was always far too oriented towards innovation and individual agency for such a strategy to really work. Collective identity was always a highly problematic issue in the West, and usually attempts to enforce a collective identity were unsuccessful. The solar aspect of the Western psyche was simply far too developed to allow for such a systematic submission of the individual to collective expectations in this way. Throughout Western culture, and increasingly throughout modern culture in general, our heroes are those who are independent rather than those who are willing to sacrifice their own dreams in order to adhere to societal expectations. Our heroes break the rules when those rules conflict with the hero's inner sense of moral imperative. But how exactly can it be presumed that the internal moral conscience of an individual can be more moral than the social expectations of the society which the individual is situated within? As with so many questions about the nature of the Western world and modernity in general, this question is one which can only be understood by looking at the nature of Christianity. Within Christianity, the spirit of Christ is understood to be identical with the cosmic logos, the fundamental will of God which generates the cosmos itself, and which thus gives form to the world. The ultimate ideal of Christianity, then, as exemplified by Jesus and his followers, is that the spirit of the divine logos can come to manifest within and reshape the individual human being through the moral consciousness of the individual. Through bringing oneself into accordance with this divine destining, the individual achieves gnosis, an apprehension of and synthesis with the cosmic logos, and thereby theosis, the realization of the will of God within the mind and body of the individual human being. The ultimate goal of Christianity, then, is fundamentally anti-conformist, in the sense that the Spirit of Christ, the Logos, is not identical with social norms or expectations, and moreover, it is a spirit which is diametrically opposed to the spirit of violence power, which animated and sustained the Roman Empire, as it is made clear throughout the narrative of the Christian Gospels. The project of Christianity is therefore not to facilitate blind obedience to any sort of doctrines or institutions, but rather it is the transformation of human beings through a metaphysical insight into the nature of reality and the nature of human existence. Through such transformation, Christianity strives to create a new kind of life world, one which is neither conformist, as is often the case in Eastern cultures, nor based on hierarchical power violence as exemplified by Rome, but rather a kind of life world in which human communities are woven together by a mutual orientation towards the cosmic logos itself. It is therefore through our orientation towards and inner transformation by that logos that the separate, individuated self-identity of modern human beings can come to be reintegrated with one another, reintegrated with our own bodies, and reintegrated with nature itself. We cannot and should not simply dissolve ourselves back into nature, nor can we simply dissolve our sense of individual self-identity back into a kind of collective, tribal, egoless mode of consciousness. Yet between dissolution and fragmented separation, there is a third option. A reintegration by which we maintain a separate identity, yet come to form a unified cohesion by transcending such differentiation. In a sense, such unification of multiplicity can be understood as the fundamental definition of beauty. We tend to see things as beautiful which express a great degree of differentiation, lots of complex details, nuances, and variety, but which somehow achieve an aesthetic unification of such difference. Properly understood, I think we can see beauty as the ultimate aim which is implicit within the nature of the cosmic logos. The ultimate purpose of the human journey can thus be seen as the creating of a self-similar microcosmic reflection of macrocosmic consciousness within the individual human being, and ultimately the reintegration of that microcosmic individuality with the macrocosmic totality. Our current age is characterized by the breakdown of social cohesion, the breakdown of the sense of connection between the human mind and human body, the breakdown of relations between men and women, the breakdown of social norms and mutualistic obligations. As these aspects of our world dissolve, we increasingly find ourselves to be stripped down to nothing but isolated and purposeless atoms, plagued by a sense of paranoia and despair. But as this process unfolds, what we can also see is the making way of a clearing, within which new forms of human life can come to develop. Yet achieving such novel life worlds must involve resolving the antagonistic relationships between the solar and lunar aspects of the human psyche, and moreover resolving the antagonisms between human existence and the natural world which we find ourselves inextricably within. We cannot resolve such hostilities by simply returning to previous modes of life. The reality is that human consciousness and the human sense of individual selfhood in particular simply is not what it was 1,000 years ago, and it is certainly not what it was 10,000 years ago. Therefore, such reintegration requires that we find ways to weave ourselves together with one another through the mutual commitment to a transcendental and metaphysically foundational moral purpose. This implies then that the core, unifying aspect of such societies must be the goal of achieving the realization of theosis in human beings, rather than structures of coercive violence, financial coercion, or normative adherence. To be clear, I am not advocating for some libertine utopia in which people just do whatever the hell they want. Norms, traditions, and social expectations are necessary aspects of any social system, but they must not themselves be identified with morality itself in the manner that we see in conformity-based societies. Such norms and traditions must be malleable, able to be created and recreated in relation to the core telos of human spiritual flourishing. In Peru, there is a region of the Amazon rainforest known as the Madre de Dios, the Mother of God. Within that name is the implication that the Mother Mary is somehow the rainforest itself, or rather that the person of Mother Mary should be understood as a human embodiment of the same archetypal powers which we see within the teeming, chaotic, and primordial world of the Amazon rainforest. Within this world, we can see much of the same motifs which are represented by Tiamat within the Sumerian creation myth. The chaotic, unpredictable, and indeterminate maelstrom of life and death, vitality and uncertainty, darkness and primality, the powers of nature which humanity sought to protect itself against in its struggle to preserve itself. If we understand this primordial chthonic darkness to be the same personality which is represented by the Mother Mary within the narrative of Christ, we can see that the form of the cosmic logos must be realized through embodiment, and that such embodiment must occur within and through the chthonic darkness of the divine feminine. What this then implies is that the Logos is also born out of that same darkness within our own souls, and therefore that the project of realizing the Logos within human beings and within human life worlds will require the reconciliation of radiant ego selfhood with the lunar darkness of the unconscious and the writhing chaos within the Earth's biosphere. As we have already observed, the cultivation within Western civilization of the solar principle is mirrored by the cultivation of the lunar principle within the Eastern world. And thus we can see that in many ways the next phase of human civilization will need to merge the insights of both East and West so as to achieve an integral and ecological cohesion within which individual identity and freedom can be synthesized with harmonious social order. We must achieve an awareness of the darkness and stillness within the divine light, and awareness of the light within divine darkness. What St. Gregory of Nyssa referred to as the luminous darkness, or what Meister Eckhart referred to as the Ungrund, the groundless ground of existence itself. Within the indeterminacy of that formless darkness is also the indeterminacy of human freedom. The formlessness which is the raw material to be reshaped in the creative unfolding of cosmogenesis. It is through the emptiness of that canvas that the possibility of creative freedom is to be found, and it is that creative freedom which will allow us to reclaim the vitality and cohesion which have been steadily annihilated by the machinations of the modernist hell world. The darkness within us is the formlessness which is informed and thereby shaped into being by the celestial realm. Such darkness, therefore, is our embodiment. It is the immanence of our existence in the world, and thus the ground of our mutualistic co-participation in the unfolding of reality.